and welcome to today's episode of LinkedIn with Louise. And today on the podcast, it's me on my own. So I thought I would do a couple of things that have been happening on LinkedIn that I've been getting quite excited about. Some new features that I've been using and getting really, really good engagement with. And I want to talk to you about those today. So the first one is LinkedIn polls, Polls. And the second one is LinkedIn events. So let's have a wee look. But before I get stuck into that, I wanted to actually read you out some of the most recent reviews I've had in the podcast, which I'm so delighted about. I mean, if you listen to somebody's podcast regularly, unless you're a podcaster, I don't really know that you could appreciate how amazing this is when somebody takes the time out of their day to go to Apple Podcasts and leave you a review. I mean, I just think it's amazing and I really, really appreciate it. So I've actually had 4 reviews since the 25th of July. So let's just read them out to you. So the first one is from Zita Christian. Zita is actually a member of my LinkedIn Learners Lab, which is my course and membership for people who are ready to really make use of LinkedIn and move forward in their business. If you want to check it out, it's socialbni.com/LinkedIn-learners-lab, and you go and see what it's all about. So Zita said, Louise Brogan has opened the LinkedIn world in a way no one else has. Her advice is practical, tested, and communicated with clarity and encouragement. Thank you so much, Zita. You are a superstar. Okay, the next one was from Connemara Lady from Ireland. And this lady left me a review that said, a great podcast, a good insight into how to use LinkedIn for the benefit of your business. Yay! Thank you. Connemara is somewhere I really want to go. I haven't been to, I think it's in County Clare. I haven't been there yet. I really want to go. Okay, then I have one from Christopher Melcher. Thank you, Christopher. And it says, best LinkedIn advice. I'm enjoying these podcasts by Louise Brogan on how to use LinkedIn effectively. Thanks, Louise. From Christopher. Christopher, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you guys leaving these reviews. It's super. And then the final one is from Julie. And Julie says, simple and strategic advice to leverage the power of LinkedIn. And Julie says, if you aren't using LinkedIn as part of your marketing strategy, be sure to give Louise's podcast a listen. Brilliant, easy to follow advice from a lovely human. That's so nice. Thank you, Julie. And Julie is the owner of Your Expert Guest, and you may have heard her recently on the podcast. So just wanted to share those with you guys and really to give a shout out to the 4 people who left me those podcasts because it's just really, really appreciate it. So if you want to hear your name on the podcast, then go and leave me a review. That would be awesome. I don't really want negative reviews. I won't say your name in the podcast if you give me 1 star. So just putting that out there. But anyway, so no, I really, really appreciate all feedback on the podcast and reviews. If you want to drop me an email about the podcast, then please feel free to. It's louise@socialbni.com. All right, so let's get stuck in here today and talk about LinkedIn polls. So LinkedIn polls are a feature that are part of your status update feature on LinkedIn. And I did a poll recently that has had over 8,500 views, which is, I think it's possibly my most engaged post that I maybe have ever had on LinkedIn. So it's kind of why I wanted to talk about it today. So I'm just going to pull it up as I'm speaking to you. So how you create a poll on LinkedIn is you go to your LinkedIn personal profile. You go to start a post, click on start a post, and at the bottom you'll see 6 different options, and we'll talk about those other options on another episode of the podcast. But today we're talking about create a poll. So click on create a poll, and then it says your question. So you write your question. You've got 140 characters, so it's really, you got to stay concise with this, guys, nice and short and sharp. Then you ask up to 4 options or 4 answers. So it could be yes or no. I tend to use all 4 options. You don't have to, but you do have to put at least 2 options. So for example, I asked recently, do you send a note when you send a connection request on LinkedIn? This is the one that had all the activity. It was really interesting. And it was really interesting to me because so many people had such different opinions on it, to be quite honest. And I love that because that actually gives me material to work with, like talking about it on this podcast today. So I've just pulled it up. It's got 8,891 views of your post in the feed. The actual poll says, do you add a note when you send a connection request? That's it. And then I said, yes, every time. Sometimes if I remember. This is the controversial one for a lot of people because I wrote no dash not sure how to. This caused people a lot of issue, the way I worded this. And then other, let me know below. You only have 4 options. So I couldn't have no, I'm not sure how to, and no, I think it's a waste of time, because then I wouldn't have the option of other, please let me know below. And if you're going to run a poll on LinkedIn, make sure that you include a final one that says, let me know below. Because remember, people will engage with your content on LinkedIn when you ask them to. Okay, if you don't ask them for their input, they're not going to actually bother giving you any input. So then once you've created the poll, you then turn it into a post. So how do you do that? You write the poll and then you click, before you hit that you're posting it, you write the caption of the content above the poll. So for this one, I wrote, are you still sending connection requests without a personal note? Let me know what's stopping you from adding a note. I'd like to know why you want to connect with me. For starters, I do. I want to know why someone wants to add me to their network. And by the way, with the 354 votes and the 195 comments underneath this poll, it's made me even clearer than ever why you should always add a note when you send a connection request. Some of the answers as to why people didn't add a note, frankly, didn't make any sense to me for this platform. But we're all different and we all do things different ways. And it's just not how I teach it. Other people teach us this differently. Okay, guys? So then I said, to find out how, so this is where using the content is helping me in my business as well. Not just finding out people's points of views below and getting people having conversations with me. But then I said, to find out how adding the note can help you win business or get your next role, come and join me on my free training online on Wednesday, the 5th of August. In brackets, for the podcast listeners, I'm running another free training online on Tuesday, the 25th of August, 2020. It's the webinar that I ran on the 5th of August. So if you attended the one on the 5th of August, you don't need to come to this one. I'm running the same webinar, although with the questions at the end, a good third of my webinars are answering people's questions at the end. So feel free to come along again, even if you were at the one in the start of August. So anyway, to sign up for that, just go to my website, socialbni.com, and search for the webinar. So that's what I wrote. And then I wrote my 3 hashtags and I sent it out. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this poll did so well. The timing of the poll, it went out around midday on a Wednesday, I believe. And I think a lot of my network are online around then. In the first hour, it started to get real engagement and then it just took off. I was still getting votes and comments even after the poll closed 7 days later. You can create your poll to run for 1 day, 3 days, 7 days, or 14 days. I'm not sure why you'd let one run for 14 days, but you know what? We'll maybe try it and test it out. Like Zita said in her review, how I teach LinkedIn is by trying everything out myself and testing and trying things to see how they work for my clients so that I can give them the best possible training on how to use the platform. And then the comments started and I replied to every single comment except for ones that I thought were just being a little bit too pernickety and trying to play devil's advocate. There only was a couple of those and I just didn't bother replying to them. But the issue that a lot of people had was they said, we have had to comment because we don't like the options that you gave in your poll. And I thought, well, you don't actually have to comment at all. Just engage with polls if you want to. But we're not here to talk about adding notes in your connection request. We're just here to talk about polls. So I have found polls really, really useful to me. What would I write a poll about? I'd write a poll about something that helps me understand what my audience want to know about, or to get interest going in whatever my content is for that week. So for example, on the podcast episode that came out with Julie Fry about being a podcast guest, that was released on Thursday, the 6th of August. Go back and have a listen to it if you haven't, the one prior to this one. And I said, here's what Julie and I talk about in the podcast. And then I created a poll. Have you been a guest in a podcast? And there's 76 votes on that so far. 63% of people have been, in my network, have been a guest in a podcast, which was surprising to some of my other audiences this week, but it's not surprising to me because that's the kind of network that I have on LinkedIn, to be honest. And again, lots of engagement and comments on there. 37 comments, 76 votes, but it gets people interested in going and checking out the podcast because it's related to the content that I'm putting out this week. So create your poll, but make sure it's strategic and it relates to whatever it is you're doing in your business. So for example, I have a podcast coming out on a Wednesday. It's about being a guest on podcasts. I run the poll the day before the podcast comes out. Have you been a guest on podcasts? People start engaging, answering. I say, well, that's really great because we're talking about this in the podcast this week. And that comes out on the Wednesday. And then the Friday, I go live with that guest to talk about being a podcast guest on my LinkedIn Live. So it all folds in nicely together. And I have found that's been a really nice, easy way for me to put together my weekly content for LinkedIn from my posts, and a really nice way for my network to engage with me. And my audience seem to really enjoy engaging in polls because I think potentially the way I write them is I'm asking for their opinion. I'm asking for their thoughts, and I respond to them in a considered manner. So the people who didn't agree with how I send connection requests with notes on LinkedIn, I didn't argue with them. I just, everyone does things differently and they do them for different reasons. So, be polite, be considerate. Remember, this is your professional platform, so remain professional. But definitely, it's definitely a feature you should try out. Let me know if you've run polls, what you think about polls, and are you going to try polls after listening to this? All right, so the second thing I wanted to talk about today on the podcast. Oh, before I go on to this, actually, I did a mini training about using polls where I walked through all of this on screen with my members inside LinkedIn Learners Lab. And as new features come out on LinkedIn, that's what I do with my members. So the course itself has 7 modules. It originally had 6, and then we built a whole new module because new features came out. And now I'm adding to it monthly with the new updates. And the more I'm using LinkedIn and the bigger my audience grows and the more things I'm finding out that I would try and test, the more content I'm adding to the LinkedIn Learners Lab. It's a 7-module course that you work through in your own time. And then we have members calls twice a month where I take all your questions and answers. And in between those calls, you can ask me whatever you want to know about using LinkedIn. You can ask me for help on how to structure your posts, how to write your polls. Basically, I'm there to help you with your LinkedIn. So do go and check it out. LinkedIn Learners Lab on my website, socialbni.com. I initially said at the start of this episode that I was going to talk about LinkedIn polls and events, but I actually think that events deserves its own episode. So I'm going to leave it there with the discussion about LinkedIn polls today. And I look forward to talking to you about LinkedIn events in a future episode. Thanks, guys. I'm sorry if you thought that I was going to be talking about events. So I hope you really enjoyed this week's talk about LinkedIn polls. I really enjoyed doing the solo episodes and I hope you find them useful. The goal of this podcast is to help you with your LinkedIn. So if there's other things that you would like to know about, then drop me a line, let me know. And remember, I love people who subscribe to my podcast, and especially if you leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, then you are my favorite people. Apart from my family, obviously. Okay, guys, thank you so much for listening this week. And I will see you next week on the LinkedIn with Louise podcast. Remember, we go live on LinkedIn on a Friday to talk about the topics in the podcast of this week. So do join me on LinkedIn on Friday. Thanks for listening. Bye.